Imagine waking up one morning and the river outside your village, a river that has never frozen solid in living memory, is now a sheet of ice thick enough to walk across. Imagine your grandfather telling you that summers used to be warm enough to grow wheat in fields that now stay frozen until June. Imagine watching your entire harvest die in the ground, not because of war, not because of the disease, but because the sky itself had changed. This is not the plot of a fantasy novel. This is exactly what happened to millions of ordinary people across Europe for nearly 500 years, during a period historians now call the Little Ice Age. And by the end of this video, you will understand how a slight shift in temperature reshaped entire nations, triggered famines, fueled witch hunts, emptied out entire settlements, and forced human beings to invent completely new ways to survive. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The coldest, cruelest of this entire era was still 100 years away from even beginning when the first cracks started to show. Stay with me, because this story gets stranger the deeper you go. Let's start with the basics, because the name itself is a little misleading. The Little Ice Age was not one single ice age like the massive glacial periods that covered continents in mile-thick ice sheets tens of thousands of years ago. Instead, it was a prolonged period of cooling that lasted roughly from the early 1300s until the middle of the 1800s, with the coldest and most brutal stretch falling between the 1600s and the early 1700s. During this time, average temperatures in Europe and other parts of the world dropped by just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius compared to the centuries before and after. Now, 1 or 2 degrees might sound like nothing. You might be thinking, so what? That's the difference between wearing a light jacket or a slightly heavier one. But here is the thing about climate systems that people often misunderstand. A small shift in average temperature does not mean a small shift in daily life. It means longer winters. It means shorter growing seasons. It means rivers and harbors that used to stay open all year now freeze for months. And when your entire civilization runs on agriculture, even a slight cooling can tip the balance between a good harvest and a devastating famine. So what actually caused this? Scientists studying tree rings, ice cores, and old historical records point to a combination of factors. There were several periods of intense volcanic activity where massive eruptions threw huge amounts of ash and sulfur particles into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the planet for years at a time. There were also long stretches of reduced solar activity, meaning the sun itself was slightly less active, producing fewer sunspots and slightly less energy reaching the Earth. On top of that, changes in ocean circulation altered how heat moved around the planet. None of this was understood by the people living through it. They had no concept of volcanic winters or solar cycles. All they knew was that the world their grandparents described was not the world they were living in. And that gap between memory and reality is where the real fear began. Now picture a farming family in rural France or Germany during the 1600s. Their entire year revolves around a predictable agricultural calendar. Plant in spring, tend through summer, harvest in autumn, survive on stored food through winter. This rhythm had worked, more or less, for generations. But now arrives late. Frost lingers into what should be planting season. Summers that used to be warm enough to ripen grain are now cooler and shorter. Autumn brings early frosts that wipe out a harvest before it's even ready to collect. For a family living on the edge of subsistence, this is catastrophic, and it wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern that repeated year after year, decade after decade, across huge portions of Europe. Historians now refer to the 1600s as a time of general crisis, when climate-driven food shortages combined with other pressures to destabilize entire societies. But the failed harvests were only the beginning. What came next is where this story turns genuinely dark. When harvests failed repeatedly, grain prices spiked. Bread, the single most important food source for the vast majority of the population, became prohibitively expensive. Poor families who might spend more than half their income on bread in a normal year suddenly could not afford enough to survive. Malnutrition spread, and malnutrition doesn't just mean hunger, it means weakened immune systems, which made populations far more vulnerable to disease. Historians have documented direct links between poor harvest years during the Little Ice Age and spikes in mortality from disease. Because starving populations simply could not fight off illnesses a well-fed population might have survived. One of the most devastating stretches came in the 1640s through the 1650s, a period so cold and so agriculturally disastrous that researchers have connected it to social upheaval across multiple continents, with repeated harvest failures fueling food riots and desperate uprisings among rural populations who had run out of ways to feed themselves. Here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. The effects of this climate shift didn't just show up as hunger and disease. They showed up as fear, suspicion, and violence. Historians who study the witch trials that swept across Europe during this period have pointed out a striking correlation between the coldest, most agriculturally disastrous years and spikes in witchcraft accusations. Think about the logic from inside a frightened, starving village in the 1600s. Crops are failing in ways nobody has ever seen. Livestock are dying. Children are getting sick and not recovering. There is no scientific understanding of volcanic ash or ocean currents. So the community searches for an explanation that fits their world. And in a deeply religious society steeped in fear of the supernatural, that explanation often became witchcraft. Someone must be responsible. Someone must have angered God or made a pact with the devil to bring this suffering down. Climate wasn't the only cause of the witch trials. There were social, religious, and political forces at play too. But the timing is striking enough that serious historians treat the cold itself as a major pressure that pushed already tense communities toward mass hysteria. Now, if you think a bad harvest and a witch hunt sound severe, wait until you hear what happened to entire settlements that had survived for centuries. Take Greenland. Norse settlers had built communities there generations earlier, during a warmer climatic period, around limited but workable farming and livestock herding. As the Little Ice Age deepened, growing seasons in Greenland shrank dramatically. Sea ice expanded and made trade and travel by ship far more dangerous, and the delicate agricultural balance these communities depended on simply collapsed. Over the following generations, settlements that had lasted for centuries were completely abandoned, not conquered, not destroyed by war, just emptied out generation by generation until nobody was left. It remains one of history's most striking examples of a climate shift erasing a society from the map entirely. Iceland faced similarly brutal conditions. Sea ice that normally stayed far from shore began pushing much closer to the coast for extended periods, disrupting fishing, one of the most important food sources for the population. Combined with volcanic eruptions that further cooled the local climate and damaged farmland with ash and toxic gases, Iceland endured repeated famines for centuries under these new conditions. But not every story from this era is only suffering. Some of it is strange, and some of it is almost beautiful. During the coldest stretches, rivers that rarely froze, like the Thames in London, began freezing solid enough to walk across, and eventually solid enough to hold entire festivals directly on the ice. These became known as frost fairs, complete with food stalls, games, and even printing presses set up on the frozen river to print souvenir pamphlets for visitors. It sounds almost charming until you remember that a river freezing that thick meant weeks or months of extreme cold that devastated fuel supplies and made daily survival brutally hard for anyone without wealth. Canals across the Netherlands froze solid enough that ice skating became embedded in Dutch culture, something you can still see in Dutch paintings from this era, which repeatedly snow-covered landscapes and frozen waterways crowded with skaters, an accidental historical record of just how consistently cold this period actually was. So how did people actually survive centuries of this? This is the part I find most remarkable, because it shows the sheer stubbornness of human adaptation under sustained pressure. Farmers shifted away from grains that needed long, warm growing seasons and turned toward hardier crops like buckwheat and rye that could survive shorter, colder seasons. Later, into the 1700s and 1800s, the potato spread across the continent, a crop that could grow in poorer soil, needed less warmth, and produced more calories per acre than traditional grains. That single vegetable would go on to help feed entire nations through conditions that would have caused mass starvation a century earlier. Homes, too. Builders used thicker walls, smaller windows to hold in heat, and steeper roofs to shed heavier snow loads. Where wood became scarce because everyone needed more fuel to survive the winters, communities turned to peat, cutting and drying it as a substitute for increasingly expensive timber. Food storage became a matter of life and death rather than convenience. Better root cellars protected food from freezing. Salting, smoking, and drying meat and fish became essential skills, since a single failed harvest meant a family needed to stretch whatever food they had across an entire winter. Grain storage improved too, with granaries designed specifically to protect surplus grain from both cold damage and pests. Governments got involved as well in ways that almost resemble early disaster policy. Some regions established grain reserves specifically to buffer against increasingly unpredictable harvests. Some cities enforced bread price controls during crisis periods, trying to stop the poorest citizens from being priced entirely out of survival. These measures were often imperfect and unevenly enforced, but they show something important: an early recognition that a changing climate demanded organized, large-scale responses, not just individual endurance. Clothing adapted it under the same pressure. Wool production became even more central to daily life, and layering techniques grew more sophisticated to preserve body heat through winters that lasted far longer than what earlier generations had known. Specialized cold weather footwear and outerwear let people keep working outdoors, tending livestock and traveling, because survival simply didn't allow for waiting indoors until warmer weather returned. Even fishing communities had to adapt, shifting locations and techniques as sea ice patterns pushed fish populations elsewhere, and the communities too slow to adjust often faced severe economic collapse. As farmland grew less reliable in certain regions, people began moving. Some drifted toward growing urban centers. They could find work outside a failing agricultural system. A slow but steady population shift that helped push parts of Europe away from a purely land-based economy and toward the early stirrings of urban and industrial life. Here's what really stays with me about this whole era. The people living through the Little Ice Age had no scientific concept of what was happening to their climate. No satellites, no global temperature records, no understanding of volcanic aerosols or solar cycles. All they had was lived experience of a world that no longer matched what their parents and grandparents had described, and an urgent, immediate need to adapt or perish. And adapt they did through new crops, new architecture, new food storage, new clothing, new economic patterns, entirely new ways of organizing a society under pressure. It's proof that human resilience is remarkable. But it's also proof that resilience has a cost, paid in famine, fear, and in Greenland's case, the complete disappearance of a centuries-old community. By the time the Little Ice Age finally eased in the 1800s, Europe had been fundamentally reshaped, not by a war, not by a single ruler, not by any single invention, but by roughly 2 degrees of average cooling stretched across 500 years. Agricultural practices had shifted permanently. Populations had moved. Entire economic systems had adapted. And it all traces back to that same image we started with, a river that had never frozen before, frozen solid enough to walk across, while somewhere nearby, a family stared at a dead harvest and tried to figure out how they were going to survive the winter that was already closing in. They survived. Their descendants are why history remembers era not as an extinction, but as one of the greatest quiet tests of human endurance the continent ever faced. If this kind of story, ordinary people up against conditions most of us will never have to imagine, is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, because there are far stranger and far more brutal survival stories still to come. Tell me in the comments which part of this hit you hardest, the frozen river, the empty villages of Greenland, or the witch trials born out of pure fear, and I'll see you in the next one.